Kia ora koutou. Thanks for coming, everyone. We're just going to get underway, and some stragglers might come in later, and that's all right too. So, welcome to our talk. We're going to be talking about contracts, some red flags and some practical tips. We're going to be giving you the idea that contracts are roadmaps for how you grow as a studio and how you do things. We want to hopefully avoid you paying too much for lawyers, because lawyers are kind of expensive. So we want to empower you with some tools and tips you can use yourself, some red flags to watch out for, and some practical tips to deal with those red flags. We've got a disclaimer too, because we're lawyers, we have to have a disclaimer. We're going to go pretty quickly through. We're going to try to give you some really useful advice. So we're not going to go into a whole bunch of detail. We're not going to cover every single situation. But these things should hopefully be relevant whether you're making a game for release on Steam or whether you're doing development work for someone else, or doing some other kind of weird and wonderful business in the game space. So, before we get underway, just a little bit about the two of us, and I'll hand over to Monica and her excellent Photoshop skills, or her very large dog.
Kia ora everybody, my name is Monica. I grew up in Hawke's Bay and then I moved down to Wellington for uni in 2019. I've been working at Avid since the beginning of last year, where I work primarily on the commercial team. So this basically means that I'm reviewing contracts every single day. In the photo here, I've got my two younger brothers. They are very serious gamers, so everything that I know about games pre-Avid comes from them, as well as a photo of my dog, because I thought she needed to be included in this.
Cool. And my name's Wade. I'm from Dunedin, but I work remotely and come up to Wellington for Avid Legal every month or so. I'm a gamer for many years, mostly PC games. This is my family, my wife and our two boys, and the oldest is 6 now, so he can actually play with us, which is pretty cool. Been playing a lot of Tito with him, and that's a heap of fun. So, in terms of business stuff, yeah, we do corporate and commercial work, which means contracts and capital raising and all the stuff for starting out a studio and then growing that to something bigger. We do a lot of work with indie devs in New Zealand, and we really love it, and that's kind of why we do what we do. So, we're going to start off with a question, because I love audience participation. What was the last contract you entered into? Anyone just throw up your hand, a lease or an employment agreement? Yep, down here. Internship? Unpaid slavery? Yeah, okay, yep. Unpaid internship, cool. Great, yep. Good, yep. That's one you don't think of, but signing or ticking a box online, that's good. We'll come back to that later, remind me at the end. Anyone else got anyone they want to throw out? Cover the main ones. So like this demonstrates a really good point, right? We think of contracts, apart from terms and conditions, being, a set of pages and, lots of little words and legalese. But I would say, if you have had a coffee today, then that was probably the last contract you had entered into, unless you got it here, in which case it was free. That's just nice. If you buy a coffee, that is a contract, right? You're saying, here's $5, they're saying, here's a coffee. That's two people agreeing to do something. We don't think of it as a contract because it doesn't have a whole bunch of pages. We're not kind of going to see our lawyer and all that sort of thing. But it is, you're agreeing things with someone else. And one of the reasons we don't think of them as contracts is that it's all very easy, right? You just go buy a coffee. You don't need 10 pages. But the reason of that is that we know we've got all the same assumptions and expectations. If you go buy a coffee, you know you're going to hand over the money before you get the coffee, probably, and then you're going to get it in a cup, which you can take away, probably. It's going to be hot. You can do pretty much what you want with it. All those things just make sense. We don't even need to say them. But when we get to commercial contracts that you might use as a studio, it's all very different, right? When do you pay? How much do you pay? What can you do with whatever it is we're talking about? What does it actually include? All of those things are up in the air unless you're really on the same page. And so one of the reasons we do write down contracts is that it helps draw out those assumptions and expectations. And it's not just about protecting you and lawsuits and all that kind of fun, crunchy stuff. It's also just about getting you both on the same page and giving you a really good roadmap for a successful relationship with someone else. So we're going to go through the red flags now and the tips. This will be relevant, whether you're starting a studio to grow it and release it, whether you've released a game already and now you're wanting to do a bit more, whether you're doing contract work, whatever. These will all be relevant to some extent. So, first red flag is the trust me bro flag. So this comes up in two situations. One is where you say, hey, look, we don't need a contract, we're friends, we get on really well. Spoiler alert, you probably do. It's just a question of scale, right? If it's paying your friend $300 to do a couple of assets for the game that you can probably swap out anyway, yeah, okay, in that case you might not need a contract. But anything more important, anything where there's going to be risk, where there's more money involved, it really is worth getting it in writing. It saves a lot of trouble and avoids a lot of disputes later on. The other one you'll see is where you're in conversation with someone, you're negotiating a contract and they say, oh, look, this is market standard, this is just in all our deals, it can't be changed, or look, we'd never use that clause, we'd never need it, but we just absolutely have to have it in the contract anyway. And that can be really dangerous if it's a clause that you don't want in there, and it can be really hard to, actually have the leverage to negotiate. So one example we had of that was a studio who were negotiating with a publisher who would give them some funding and do the publishing work to finish the game. And they had a clause in there which said something like, the publisher doesn't need to release the game if it's not economically viable. And so we were sitting there going, well, we're engaging you to publish the game. Like, we want to release this game. You can't just decide you're not going to do that, because then we can't do it. So we're kind of just stuck. And they said, oh, look, we'd never use that, but we still need it in there. And so, I mean, in that case, we kept going with the negotiations, but that was a sticking point. And eventually that studio went with a different publisher, and I think they got a better result out of that. And probably dealing with that first publisher would have been a whole lot more problems. Just because of how they were approaching the contract negotiation. So, what can we do about the trust me bro approach? First of all, just get it in writing. It really does help. Use that as a chance to state those assumptions and draw out everything and make sure we're all on the same page. If you're a early studio, then do back yourself to negotiate. It's very easy to think, we're a 3-person studio in the bottom of the world. This is some big, hooded horse or Microsoft or whoever, this big company, we can't possibly do anything. Look, you can. There's a limit on what you can do, but they wouldn't be talking to you if they didn't want what you had, so you can negotiate and you can try and give yourself the best deal that you can get. If you are later, this is just a little bonus tip, if you're amending contracts later, I really like doing that either with a proper amendment or by email. What I've seen is some people doing stuff by Discord and WhatsApp messages, and then when things go wrong and you do end up coming to a lawyer and saying, hey, look, we had this contract, but then we changed this and we changed this bit, and you're sending screenshots of Discord to me, and it's a pain. It makes it a bit harder to really see what's going on. So sometimes a little bit of formality is good. You don't necessarily need to sign in person, with witnesses and things, but just a little bit. Just move from Discord to email. Cool. So that's the first tip, and I'm going to hand over to Monica to talk about the second one.
Perfect. So our second red flag is vague obligations. Now, I think vague obligations are one of the trickier red flags to pick up on, simply because they might look fine on the page. There won't be anything, that's obviously aggressive. It might even seem fair or balanced. But the problem with these types of clauses is they tend to miss out on things like timing, scope, deliverables, the kind of specific details that are really required to make a contract work. And it's without these details where things tend to go wrong. So we'll often see clauses like what's on the screen come across our desk, publisher will endeavour to release the game. Again, I think this looks fine on first glance, but when you really interrogate it, endeavour just means to try. So the publisher will try to release the game. They're not really making any specific type of commitment to actually release the game. And even if you take out the word endeavour, publisher will release the game. What's the timing around this? It's entirely possible that the publisher could just keep delaying the release of the game and you can't really do anything about it. Silence also in the contract just says nothing at all about those types of specific details, what happens is that both the parties kind of fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. And of course, there's just no guaranteeing that you're going to be aligned on what is expected of the contract. We finally have contractor will provide marketing services. Again, this is something that I think looks fine on the page, but what does it actually mean? To one party, marketing could be, an entire campaign. So that could be events, influencers, ads, whereas to the other party, it could just be, like one Instagram post. So you're on completely different pages there. And again, the risk here is twofold. One, you don't really know what you're going to be on the hook for. And then two, you don't really know what you can enforce against the other party in the event that they don't follow through with what you thought to be an obligation. So we see this come up quite a bit in the age of generative AI. We had a client come to us recently with a dispute regarding some data and IP. We took a look at the contract and it was pretty obvious that AI had written it and it hadn't done a very good job. The drafting was just super messy. The IP section just didn't really make any sort of sense, and there were just kind of key items missing from the contract. So it was pretty unavoidable that they ended up in a dispute over, how to handle the IP or what could be done with that IP. And the thing is, under a well-drafted contract, the issue might have been about $500 for our client, but it eventually blew out into something far more expensive. So it kind of just goes to show how clarity and like ensuring that you have a workable contract in real life really saves yourself from a headache later down the line. So then how do we counteract vague obligations? You want to really specify who does what and when, be really clear about payment terms. A really good way to check is to check with a friend. If they read it and they can't tell you who's supposed to be doing what, when something needs to be done by, what the specific obligations in the contract are, then it's entirely likely that the contract isn't going to work. And finally, it's really good to own the commercials. You're going to be the best person to understand and kind of fight for those commercials. So really hold on to those specific details, throughout the negotiations when you're talking about it with a lawyer. Just really hold on to those commercial points. This takes us to red flag number 3, which is unclear IP. Wade, did you want to briefly explain what IP is for everyone?
So IP is intellectual property. It's one of your core assets. It's all your code, your art, your music, everything that really goes into the game. And it can get really messy and complicated. So again, we're going to try and keep this quite simple. So look, two ways that it comes up. One is when it's silent on IP and there's just nothing there and it's a bit uncertain. Maybe you're maybe wanting to license some IP, but you haven't really written it properly, and then it just gets really messy as to what you can do with that, and especially when things go wrong later. The second one that we see a lot is joint IP, and Joe mentioned this yesterday, and I can see him nodding. It's just bad, just don't do it. People think it's a good way to solve a problem, and it's not. So again, we could spend an hour on IP just itself, but just enough to say, in fact, let's just go over here. If you've got something where IP is relevant, which a lot of contracts will be relevant, especially when you're dealing with your game or your software, you want to spell out what's happening. Someone will own it and someone will license it, probably, and just avoid joint IP. That's a really simple, nice, if you remember nothing else from this weekend, remember to avoid joint IP, except in the cases when it's fine, but that's very seldom. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Monica, for liability.
Dodgy liability. Okay, so liability is kind of what happens when something goes wrong. Throughout the course of your relationship with the other party, you're probably not really going to be thinking about this, but in the event that something does go wrong, this will become one of the most important provisions in the contract. And it's oftentimes when lawyers are going to get involved, but we've kind of just tried to map out a few things just to be wary of when you are entering into the contract. The first being uncapped liability. So If the contract is silent on whether there's a cap or not, the default position tends to be that your liability is uncapped. So this essentially means that even if, say, the value of the contract is about $5,000, it's possible that you could be on the hook for somewhere upwards of, $100,000. It's just completely unpredictable, and you can't say what you're going to be on the hook for. Equally, if liability is there's an imbalance between the parties. So if you're signing up to a cap of, say, $10,000 while your counterparty is signing up to a cap of $5,000, that's just completely imbalanced and not something that you really want to be signing yourself up for. Liability for others, generally you want your liability to flow from actions that are within your own control. If you mess up, then sure, you should probably be on the hook for that. But if, say, a third party messes up, which you had nothing to do with, you shouldn't be taking responsibility for that. So we just want to try and ensure that you're able to control anything that might flow into liability. And finally, indemnity. Now, we're not going to try and explain what indemnity is. It's something that's very, very complex. It's, I kind of think of it as like a stronger promise to pay. Generally, what we're just wanting to let you know here is to try and avoid indemnities where possible. If you see the words indemnify or hold harmless in a contract, try and stay clear of them or seek advice from a lawyer. If there is an indemnity and they're insisting on it, you want to really ensure that the scope is limited and that it is able to be controlled. You're able to have some control over it. But yeah, just try and avoid indemnities where possible.
And like there's a whole lot more to this, and there are times when you'll need to give an indemnity, but if you're doing this yourself and you're not using a lawyer yet, or not for this particular contract, just keep an eye out for that, and then try and understand, okay, what is this doing? What am I on the hook for? Is it actually reasonable? Americans love to just do mutual indemnities, and it's a pain, but whether you can get them out is a different question. So to kind of drive some of this home, we had a client who got some cybersecurity work done by a consultant, an expert in the space. Unfortunately, and they paid them $50,000 or something like that. A reasonable amount of money, but not heaps. The consultant didn't do a good job, and they left a firewall open. I'm not a tech person, so let's say they left a firewall open. The client got hacked. They got a ransomware attack, and the people said, look, pay us $1 million in Bitcoin and we can give you your files back. And so they did, because they had no option. Then they went and figured out what the problem was and who had caused it, and they went to that consultant and said, hey, you screwed up. Pay us $1 million for all the money that we've lost. And the consultant said, have you seen the terms and conditions that you signed? It says my liability as consultant is limited to the fees paid. So if you want your $50,000 back, sure, here you go, but I don't have to pay you that $1 million. Not great for the client, who was then $1 million out of pocket. Great for the consultant, who didn't go bankrupt from having to pay this giant bill. So it's a good illustration of just understanding what is it appropriate in this situation and what can you actually negotiate. You wouldn't want to be the consultant on the hook for $1 million, and you wouldn't want to be the client who can't recover that $1 million. We see lots of issues with liability and indemnities. Sometimes you'll have the person signing whatever contract is giving a personal guarantee or an indemnity of all the fees of the business, and there's some dodgy stuff that happens, and often it's stuff that doesn't come across our desk until it's too late. So it's just going in with an open mind and trying to figure out what's going to work for you. I'll just recap to say, good limits on liability are essential, and only be liable for your own actions if you can manage that. So we're almost there. We're on the last flag, which is around termination and exit. And the topics we've talked about come up again and again, whether it's you looking at your own contracts or you coming and dealing with the lawyer and trying to get through things. So two things that can be a problem. If termination is too hard, you're locked in for 10 years and you can't get out, even if they breach the contract, even if they go out of business, that's not great. Or the other one is it's too easy for them to get out, right? So you might have this 10-year contract and you're in this great partnership, but they can terminate on 30 days notice for no reason at all. That's not great if you're actually, putting a lot of money and time and effort into this relationship and they can just yank the rug from under your feet, especially if there are unfair consequences of termination. So, we see a lot of publishing agreements and, they often try to say, oh, look, if we don't like the game or we think it's not viable, we can terminate. And you go, well, no, it's like a marriage kind of, right? You don't have a marriage where one person can just leave and the other person's locked in and can't get out. That's a whole different issue outside this talk. Also looking at those consequences, if it's a publishing agreement, they may be able to say, if you breach, we can terminate, and then if we terminate for your breach, we can take over the game and release it ourselves. And look, sometimes you'll have to accept that, and you can see why they would want it, but it's also worth fighting. As a general rule, look, if you've got a publishing agreement on the table, please come and see a lawyer. Don't do that yourself. They're complicated and really important. But this is true even for other simpler contracts. So, in terms of getting a fair exit regime, look, it always depends. But I've tried to put kind of a cheat sheet for you. If I was better at design, I would have made this a triangle, but I haven't, and I couldn't be bothered changing it. So imagine it's a triangle and imagine it's flipped up the other way. So your base level, in any contract almost, you should be able to terminate for breach if they do something really bad. You should be able to terminate for insolvency if they run out of money. And maybe for what's called a force majeure event, which is something beyond your reasonable control. So a fire, a flood, epidemic, pandemic, war, terrorism, all those kind of crazy things that, no one's really to blame. To me, that's kind of the base level. If you don't have that, you can imply it sometimes, but it gets a bit tricky. Those are pretty common. The second level is whether you've got something beyond that, like a kind of a cancellation or a termination for convenience. Again, sometimes that'll be appropriate. Sometimes you actually want to give them the right to cancel, but just put a fee on it. Other times you just want to make that mutual so that it's even between the two of you. You definitely don't want to be in a situation where you're locked in for 5 years and you thought you could just turn it off next month like Netflix, but you're actually stuck. So do focus on that kind of no-fault termination. And then at that final level of the pyramid is, what are the consequences of termination? And they could often be different between convenience and breach. And often the drafting isn't great. And when we look at the contract, we go, this doesn't actually all match up. So this is one of the areas we often pay a lot of attention to. And even if you're working with us, you really need to know, what do you expect out of this? What do you want to see? And then you can tell your lawyer, hey, this is what I want, how do we make that happen? Or you can do that yourself and figure it out. So that was the final flag and final tip. To just recap all of these, if you have that trust me bro type approach, again, just write it down. If you've got vague obligations, have specific obligations. Be clear on who does what and when. If the IP is unclear, then clarify it. And really do protect it. That's really important to you. Make sure your liability works and it's not a really unfair regime, and watch out for those indemnities. And make sure that the termination provisions work. And that's all there is to it. It's really easy. Contracts are not a problem. Obviously, we're at a very high level here. As a little bonus, a story about T's and C's and terms and conditions, as you said before. If you click accept on the T's and C's, that is a contract, and you're signed up to whatever that contract says. You're not going to get your lawyer to review every T and C's you accept. I don't even review all the ones that I accept. I don't think... I've read a couple of end-user license agreements. The Baldur's Gate 3 one is good because I think you sell your soul to Larian Studios, which is fine. I probably did over that summer. I played a lot of that game. Point with T's and C's is that sometimes they can be a problem. There was a case in Australia with Michael Hall Jeweller, and one of the managers or whoever there clicked accept. I've read these PDF terms. It was a packaging contract. Right, so not really that exciting, to be honest. Eventually, Mike Hill decided we'll go with a different supplier, so they changed supplier and started doing this. That's fine. Except it wasn't, because in those terms and conditions, there was a minimum term, there was a minimum purchase obligation, and there was an exclusivity clause. So when they terminated, they were in breach of the contract, and they didn't even realise, because they probably even hadn't even stored that in their in their document system anywhere. So, it went to court, and the other party sued, and the guy said, well, look, I didn't enter into a contract. I just, clicked things. I didn't read them. I'm not bound because I didn't read them, right? And the judge was like, no, you're definitely bound. You clicked accept. Like, that's how life works. End result was that they got sued for $3 million and they lost. So that was a really expensive mistake of not checking terms and conditions. Mostly that won't be the case. Most terms and conditions you're probably going to be fine. But every once in a while you get a nice little case like that, which is pretty painful if you're that person at Michael Hill who lost the company $3 million. It wouldn't be a great day for you, or a great year. So look, there's the flags and there's the tips to watch out for. Do we have any questions? And if we don't, that's fine too, because I feel like we're going good for time. So, and what I can actually do, if you want to take photos, is that this will be recorded, though, so you can look at it later if need be. And look, I'm around for most of the day, so come have a chat to either of us and ask all the questions you want. Get the free, it's not advice, but get the free pointers while you can. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.